Oh, there it is, okay. Look at this one.
1807.
And that's the woolen mills.
Yeah.
Isn't that something? Look at the river. River.
So that's from this. That's from the, what is that, Dulac Street side?
Yes, yes, I think so. Yeah, looking back at the river. Trying to eat the building.
It's funny how we always want to build things along rivers.
Well, it used to be a source of transportation
Yeah.
and a source of energy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and probably drinking water, flushing water.
Well, yeah.
We have a quorum of TIF. We do not have a quorum of EDC. But we could I don't know that we're gonna get a quorum of EDC, because I know Dan's not coming. I haven't heard from him.
Dean Cashman.
I don't know about.
You on the TIF or the EDC?
EDC.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So you
And I
can't
don't
do
know
minutes.
about- And I don't know about
You're,
Ben
okay, yeah.
Carter.
We met last time though, right?
I
think so.
Yeah,
I
okay.
think so.
Hasn't been to a meeting yet.
I've got half a year.
I've never even heard the name.
Saying we're gonna get a quorum.
I'm like, who? Yeah.
Nothing to you. So what my suggestion would be that we go ahead and start the meeting on time with the quorum of TIF. If we get a quorum of EDC, then we'll
We can do the
pause
notes.
the meeting and minutes.
Did you get my note and my response? I gotta leave at 5 again. I gotta go to the rink. I can't. You did get that note though? Did you see it? Or whoever I responded to, I put it in there.
No, you maybe responded to that.
Probably Beth. Oh, I don't wanna all of a sudden have a quorum and then
All right,
you're gonna get a subtraction.
yeah. No, we'll go ahead and, in a minute, we'll get started with TIF and start the presentation. That's all right.
That's good.
I do have my spiel whenever it's the right time.
So how do they relate to this? The number that you have, one, is one?
That's the project? Well, no, I don't think so.
I don't think so.
It would be nice if they related to each other, wouldn't it? Yeah. Okay, all right. Okay.
Okay, Mr.
I'd
Chair.
like to call the meeting of the
Good.
Tax Increment Financing Committee to order. Christine Hadari, Victoria Smith, Barry Schuster are all here.
Okay,
That's sufficient for a quorum. Call the meeting to order.
perfect. And we will pause on the EDC meeting, which we don't have a quorum of EDC members, so we'll hold off on calling them to order, but we'll go ahead and start the discussion for tonight. Very quickly, this meeting is being conducted in accordance with RSA 91A. It's being conducted here in person in the Lebanon City Council chambers. This meeting can be accessed through the city's virtual platform. Instructions on how to enter the meeting remotely are available on the city's website. If there are any problems with the virtual platform, the meeting will continue as the only legal requirement under 91A is to have a quorum of members present here in person, as we do. Individuals speaking remotely who wish to speak when public comment is allowed can unmute themselves and ask to be recognized by the chair. Individuals attending in person who wish to speak when public comment is allowed can raise their hand and ask to be recognized by the chair. Individuals attending in person should approach either the podium or the presenters table here to use the microphone so that everyone in the room and attending virtually can hear what's being said. For any individual speaking, whether remotely or in person, please state your name and ward of residence in Lebanon or the name of the community where you live. If appropriate, please be prepared to spell your name for the recording secretary. So tonight, this is a continuation of the downtown parking lot redevelopment study that's been going on. It started back in the spring. The consultants who are online, I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. They met with both committees, EDC and Downtown TIF, first back in June as part of a kickoff day that they spent here in town. They subsequently had a number of public engagement and trying to get opportunities to solicit public input over the summer. They came back to the boards at the end of September 25th, and held an update meeting with Downtown TIF and EDC committees, and then proceeded to have a public input session, public comment session later that night. So now they've taken what they heard from the committees and from the public on September 25th. They've gone to the drawing board. They've come up with some scenarios that address some of the different options here. And that's what they're going to be presenting tonight and walking through some of what they've come up with. Josh, can you hear us okay?
Sure can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great.
I believe you are set up as a presenter. So you can share your screen whenever you're ready, or you can go ahead and introduce your team if you'd like.
Yeah, why don't we, we'll introduce ourselves. I think I recognize most of these faces from our last meeting in September, but we'll refresh you on who we are. So we have two attendees here from Placework. We are the architect and project management entity of the study. So I am Josh Lacasse, the project manager for Placework, and we have Sarah Mountainford here, who's our designer. We've got three on the line from Agency Landscape and Planning, so I want to let you all introduce yourselves, and then one from Landwise, who's our economic development consultant. And John can introduce himself at the end.
Hi all, good to see you again. My name is Kate Tuke. I'm a landscape architect and principal at Agency Landscape and Planning. I'll pass it to Barrett. Your English, please.
Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm Barrett. I'm a landscape designer with Agency. I'm Rachel Bell Alexander, and I'm a urban designer with Agency.
As well as advisors, we were the economic consultant on the team.
Okay. All right, Josh.
One moment so I can share my screen. Okay. So we intended to be with you all in person tonight. The weather put a damper on travel plans with some flooding expected. So apologies for the virtual meeting. It's always better to do these things face to face. But we'll just go through the agenda. We're going to start with a quick recap. So we'll give you a sense of where the project is at, a little project status update. And we'll recap the guiding principles. This won't be new information to these groups. We presented this information back in September, so it's really just a refresher. We'll try to get that stuff out of the way pretty quickly. And then we'll jump right into some of the new work that we've been developing since our last meeting in September. So that's that scenario review. At the end, we'll hope to have a vigorous discussion and some look ahead to the next steps. I think really the goal behind this meeting is to bring you all up to speed on what we've learned over the past several months, some of the progress that we've made, and really serve as sort of a midstream check-in during the development of these scenarios, so that you can have an opportunity to provide feedback, or validate some of the ideas that we've developed, or provide that sort of feedback so that we can incorporate that for the next steps of the project. So essentially the schedule look ahead, we're here in December. We're about 2/3 of the way through scenario development. As I said, this is really a midstream check-in. And we really want to look at tonight's meeting as sort of a preview meeting for the next engagement, which will be in January. The date is TBD at this point, but really this is when we'll come back to Lebanon in person, if all goes well, and be able to present some of these scenarios to the public, having been vetted with the city management, key players as well as these, the EDC and TIF committees for your feedback. So tonight we're going to be looking at a number of options. I think I would just encourage you to not, they're just options. I think they're really indicative of some of the ideas that we've been developing. And the goal is to sort of solidify that for that next meeting in January. After January, the intent would be to take any comment received from the public forum. Some pieces of feedback from the public may be incorporated into the schemes. Others may be just documented in the report, depending on the nature of the comment, and really come back to the city council sometime in late March. It's looking like, and give that final presentation. So we are looking ahead to wrapping up with the scenario planning in spring of 2025. And again, just a quick recap. This is the site we're focused on. It's the parking lot area behind City Hall and the Opera House, River Valley Community College, etc. The city came to us with several goals identified already. So this list indicates the city's stated goals from the outset of the project. So strengthening the downtown experience, and that might mean different things to different folks. Increasing visual access to the Mascoma River and potentially other types of access. Again, access has a different meaning to different people around town. Demonstrating economic viability and looking at these projects through a financial feasibility lens is an important piece. Increasing the housing availability in Lebanon, and then enhancing connectivity for bikes and pedestrians. And from that, we developed just an expanded list of guiding principles. These will be used continually as we develop these scenarios, just to kind of measure ourselves, measure the scenarios against, and make sure that we're proceeding along the goals that we set out. So they do have some parallel with the city's goals, but I'll just run through them really quickly. They're not new. Improving the circulation for both vehicles, people, bicycles is a key goal, along with ease of parking. So making it easy for folks to get downtown, to park downtown, and in case of scenarios which provide housing, to store their car near where they live. So we talked about connecting to the river. Again, some of these scenarios do that in different ways. Similarly, opportunities for recreation. We don't strictly need, like you see at the CCDA. I think that this is a broad category that may include different types of activities, arts, recreation, sort of public gathering, things like that. And then, of course, the supply of housing, expanding the choices, looking at different types of housing, how that might impact the scenarios. And finally, sort of along the lines of sustainability, so making sure that this project can be feasible without excessive subsidy from the city. Site sustainability, of course, we're on a riverfront, looking at ways of optimizing the natural environment and making sure that we are designing for resilience, etc. And of course, looking at both the direct economic benefits to the city and also the sort of spin-off benefits of economic development, enhanced opportunities in the city, etc. Okay. So that was all recap. Now we're getting into the new information. We thought before we jump into the scenario development, it would be helpful to look at some of the takeaways, things that our team learned over the course of starting to put pen to paper and develop these scenarios. So these are just some high-level things. we learned, of course, a lot more than this, but I think this is a summary of things that we took away from our initial scenario development. So basically, just to go through these, assumed property line negotiation in development-heavy schemes. What this means is we understand there are some ongoing investigation into existing property and title issues, and of course those will need to be worked out with the relevant professionals. For the most part, the scenarios you're going to see tonight assume that those can be resolved either through negotiation or other means to make this use feasible, et cetera. The second bullet point there, economic viability challenges in most scenarios. I think that means feasibility is, there are different ways of assessing feasibility. John's going to get into a little bit more about what we found once we get through the overview of the schemes, but there are challenges to most of these that we'll need to talk through and different opportunities for addressing those challenges. Development of floodplain likely in scenarios 3 and 4. What this means is essentially that some of the schemes that necessitate a greater built footprint for whatever reason, they may require some built environment or some disturbance in the floodplain, which is essentially the level of the lower parking lot. Of course, it'll be developed according to industry standards and regulatory requirements. All of the designs you'll see tonight can be permitted, etc. But it adds a little bit of extra complexity in the process. And then I think, not surprising to anyone, but the last bullet point, so free parking for 225 cars, which was established during our last presentation as a baseline target based on the parking study conducted this summer, plus any required parking for our development footprint is challenging. Spaces at a premium, structured parking comes at a cost, and so we need to look at this with a balanced approach for parking and other requirements. And so the final just sort of background piece of information before we dive right in is just to look back at some of the past proposals that the city has worked through. You'll see from left to right sort of 2016 downtown plan, and then the 3, I believe it was 2022, the request for expressions of interest, I believe it was termed, but the proposals received from that process from the various design teams and development teams. So just to kind of summarize here, the downtown plan, it was looking at about 165 to 175 units of housing. Unclear how many parking spaces. I don't think they really got to that level of detail, but they were proposing a fairly large structured parking garage on the site that we are studying now. Just moving over, just for context, the Rodney proposal, this one second from the left, proposed about 210 units of housing and about 215 parking spaces. So really a 1-for-1 housing to parking ratio with nothing left over to provide for public parking or anything beyond that. Somewhat in contrast to that is the Cato proposal, where they were getting about 500 parking spaces. The way that they did that is they essentially built the design that you see here, they proposed the design you see here, to go right over the existing parking lot. And then they were also burying a structured parking garage kind of within the volume of this building that you see in the image. So a lot of parking. They were getting about 100 to 140 units of housing, depending on, they had a few sub-options, I think. And then finally on the right, I believe this is a housing initiative proposal, 60 to 74 units of housing, about 217 parking spaces. So just for context, I think it's helpful just to kind of look back at these and understand what the various proposals were suggesting. I think you'll find that when we go through our proposals or our scenarios tonight, we're sort of falling between these two ones on the right as far as the number of housing units, although nowhere near the 500 parking spaces of the Cato proposal. Okay, I'll take a breath, make sure there are no questions. All right. So I think we're going to run through now 4 different scenarios. Actually, we have sort of 2 scenarios for scenario 4, so you'll see 5 different ideas. So sort of a standard disclaimer here, all of these really right now are at the idea stage. So please bear in mind that different ideas from one scenario might be transferable to another and vice versa. All of the scenarios don't necessarily need to stand on their own, so I just encourage you to think broadly about ideas as we go through. And then the other thing I would say is that our materials are in flux. I said this is an in-stream presentation. You may see some numbers that are, slightly off from the advanced packet you received. That's because we are continually working, even sort of this morning, to revise everything. So bear with us, but the material that you see now should be substantively similar to what you received in your packets. So Kate, do you want to take it away?
Sure. First, I'm going to walk us through our engagement efforts. So I guess kind of our flow for each of these scenarios, we'll be talking about engagement, talking about some precedent images that we drew some inspiration from, and then showing these overall site plans for each scenario. So that summary slide from the previous slide where we're showing the different scenarios, we have presented the concept of these at a September engagement meeting, as well as, we gave the guiding principles of the circulation and connection to river and ask for folks to add their comments to each of these. And so this is what we heard. So for scenario 1, we saw a lot around improvements to the parking lot. So trying to allow for there to be good, strong accessibility for folks to nearby shops and such. So trying to really gain accessibility on the upper level for parking. But then also trying to add shade to the site or better wayfinding, trail and signage and such like that. So I'll pass to Kate to talk about precedents in the plan.
Yeah, so at its best, a great parking lot repair is also going to offer a much improved rail trail experience. And we shared this example with you before, but Newburyport, Massachusetts has long had parking on its waterfront, but also a really nice waterfront promenade experience that is buffered from the parking by a healthy planted berm. So you really feel separate from that parking and connected to the river as you move along that trail. There's one other image of this, again, just to highlight proximity. You're standing here in the parking, looking at that promenade, but you really have this separated experience. So moving ahead to the plan, what does this look like in Lebanon? What we assume here, a slight reduction of parking in order to make room for a more robust riverfront trail. So the bike trail comes out from the tunnel, comes over towards the river front, and makes a much more generous connection to its existing location on the right-hand side near Taylor Street. Really what this allows us to do is, again, have a planted buffer, an opportunity for people to have a continuous connection with a great experience and touch point along the river. You can also see that the parking lot is greener, and we've accomplished some of that extra space for the bike path by compressing the parking and making one-way drive lanes with angled parking. So as you come from Taylor Street, you have a kind of obvious one-way loop through. If you're moving through on Taylor Street, you can park or you can loop back to find additional parking opportunities. But it's a little bit more intuitive and a little bit more compressed. We've lost a couple of parking spaces due to that additional greening and the opportunity to connect along the river, but still have the 270, which meets that core goal of the existing capacity. So if you go to the next slide, you'll just see this in a perspective view. So you're flying over the community center and the futsal courts right now. Looking at that parking area, you can see again that widened buffer by the river, the opportunity to bring a really generous bike route and rail corridor through there. And then the green parking lot with that green corridor that connects from Port Street directly down through the parking lot with much safer pedestrian connections to the riverfront experience and the opportunity to make those east-west connections. The shade will also add a kind of additional comfort and human scale to the parking lot. You can see down on the bottom just a few of the key metrics and numbers, and we can continue to discuss these throughout, but obviously this has no residential units added, it's just a parking lot repair. You have those 270 spaces. It's on the order of $3 to $4 million to make this kind of repair as well as the landscape improvements and to add soil depth and volume for trees to thrive long term. So on the next slide, we're going to switch to scenario 2.
Yes, and so for engagement, what we heard here, a lot of enthusiasm for getting this connection to the river, both to be able to have some visual sight from benches to a walkway, as well as just having more of an opportunity to be able to experience nature with through plantings and having a park. I think that there was also an enthusiasm for maintaining this scenario, both to support events that could happen in this park as well as the needs of downtown. I'll pass it back to you, Kate.
Yeah, so we can't underscore enough that how much we heard that people really love the opportunity to look out over the river, to have this moment of parkland and better connection between downtown and the river. Here's an example from work we've done in Cincinnati, Ohio. The idea that people just love to sit and promenade alongside a river and have that vista and the experience of light and sparkling water that really draws people down to that experience. On the next slide, you can see just another example. It's a little closer to home in Franklin, New Hampshire, but the idea that a smaller riverfront park can also really artfully step down to the water's edge and give people an opportunity to engage in boating activities, but also just to touch the water, to be at its level, and to understand what it means to have a river flowing through the center of the city. So this can be a really delightful multi-purpose space that takes that step down to access the water's edge. So on the next slide, you'll see in plan how this could start to take shape. You can see big picture, if we start just with Flynn and Court Street, the goal is that those become becomes a one-way route from Flynn Street exiting on Court Street. That still provides service to some of the key buildings that have their back doors to this space. It also provides access to a parking area, which is reserved, that has about 105 spaces. It could be accessed off of Taylor Street or off of Flynn Street. So we're balancing parking with a pretty generous park space. And you'll see in the red notations, these are grade notations. So the park itself has to step down almost 10 feet of grade across its entire distance. And so you can see that that grade is navigated in a pretty generous green corridor where you have this moment of prospect at the corner of Court and Flynn Street. You're looking out at the river across a green and flexible lawn space. You can step down a series of seat walls, have lots of seating and opportunities to enjoy that park space. You can also navigate that accessibly by moving to the left and then to the right again on a series of ramps. You have a flexible lawn, which could be used for events, and a river deck, which also is a place for folks to get out over the river. It's a place to picnic and meet neighbors on a daily basis, but also a place that could have some sort of informal stage built into it. So you could host events here without too much bringing in additional infrastructure. You can see also on the left-hand side, again, we're navigating a lot of grade here between the top of the tunnel and the wall, stepping down, and then in this idea of stepping all the way down to the river's edge with an amphitheater, a satellite sort of sand beach, an opportunity to get down to that level, experience the water, and create some additional flood space for when the river is at its maximum capacity. On the next slide, you'll see the vision of what this could look like. Again, you're floating over the community center and the futsal fields, and you can see just the sketch version of that parking lot area on the left. Again, holding space for about 105 cars, access from both Flynn and Taylor Streets. The way that the darker green band of planting could help navigate about 8 feet of grade, as well as those steps coming down from Court Street. The ability to use that flexible lawn for picnics, for kite flying, for flexible sports, or for events. And then the water deck, which could have a shade trellis built in for everyday use as well as informal stage use. And then in the far distance, you can see the way that the riverfront amphitheater could step down all the way to the water and provide that tactile moment at the water's edge. As we said, this is about 105 parking spaces. Most of the landscape is built on grade, so it's an investment, but not a really high level investment that you'll see in some of the landscapes on structure coming up soon. So in that $10 to $13 million cost range, and again, no residential units added in this scenario.
Moving on to scenario 3. It seems that for a lot of folks, there was enthusiasm with this idea of a partial redevelopment, of redeveloping the upper level and keeping the lower level as a park portion to be able to maintain that access to the river. There was some excitement about bringing arts to the space, to the park or to the partial redevelopment. And there was also just some places where folks either voiced uncertainty or questions around developing or putting housing here. So wanting to kind of understand, the desire to put housing in a specific space. And I'll pass it to Barrett to walk through the scenario.
Yeah, so here you can see an example right here in Cambridge of activation of the river space along the Charles River for arts and events, the terracing down with access for the pedestrian corridor along the actual riverfront, as well as the lawn. And so this, in combination with the next precedent, we've really started to take a look at the different ways of incorporating civic space with the riverfront. So you're kind of starting to blend architectural elements with the free open public space and activation of that immediate riverfront corridor. Maybe there's a dining space area, lounging area, 24/7 access. So you can see how this starts to play out in the plan on the next slide. This is where we started to incorporate the addition of the links into the scheme. So here you've got a parking garage, and which is going to be about 144 parking spaces, as well as some parking space to the right. Your landscape on structure makes an appearance, which ushers you down towards the riverfront. The grade change is negotiated here, starting at 583, with stairs and ramp taking you down to the river. Bike paths is still connecting, all wheels path is still connecting the rail trail from the east all through down south towards the top, with a pedestrian walkway taking you from the flex lawn in the center back down towards the sidewalk connection on the west. Taylor Street is making an appearance, cutting straight through the site, allowing active vehicular access coming straight through, as well as vehicular access stuff from Cordon Street. And here you can see there's still robust palette planting and a lot of public open space as well for activities, for sports, for events. It's a pretty broad space, and it's about, I think, half an acre, so less landscape than the previous scheme scenario 2. So you still have a lot of space, and you can see here how that space is really incorporating the structural sheet, maybe they're sheet walls, maybe they're stairs that start to bring you down. Getting this round view from the city down towards the riverfront. And you can see how the all-wheels path really winds through the entire site, bringing you along towards the existing sports courts, the event space, the lawn along the river, and back through down towards the tunnel and to the sidewalk. Pass it on to Josh and Sarah, talk about scenario number 4.
Sure. Thank you, guys. So I think that for scenario 4, defining the term full redevelopment is a major theme. So there was, in the public process, there was a lot of concern with, of course, the parking availability, making sure that there are places for people, so places for gathering, eating, those commercial activities that make downtown Lebanon special. And a connection, maintaining a robust connection to Colburn Park, as that really is sort of the heart of the city. This site would be viewed as almost the counterpoint or the foil to Colburn Park. So, we have a little bit of a progression here of the scenario 4, so bear with us, and we have 2 options to run through. So scenario 4A is probably the most similar to the downtown vision study. This is where we really try to maximize that upper portion of the site for the built environment. So this involves really rerouting Taylor Street sort of up toward Flynn and across the site like this to reconnect to where it comes out by the charter school. Building a structured parking garage on this sort of foreground part of the site that would accommodate about 240 cars, and then a podium parking deck on the other piece of the site toward the charter school that accommodates about 31 spaces. The other significant move here is the closure of Court Street and really the establishment of this crossing where you get this green connection from Colburn Park up at the upper left, coming down to the right and across the screen. And when you start to layer in a program to this, we really wanted to develop that crossing as sort of a commercial core, or being able to emphasize almost a node of activity. So at that location, we proposed consolidating some commercial development as part of this scenario. You may notice that I think we may have masculine bank reps here, but we haven't taken over your site. This is just to acknowledge the idea that there may be potential for future redevelopment depending on what happens in the future with the drive-through, et cetera, the parking space there. So this one purple block that you can kind of see in the white background here is actually off our site, but it's really to reinforce that idea of creating this commercial core. And then when you layer in sort of the rest of the purple, light purple here would be the residential functions. You can start to see sort of this building take shape. We might be able to potentially sort of link all of these pieces together and create sort of a cohesive whole in the center here. You may be able to sort of frame a view from what is now Court Street, looking down toward the river, and then of course the bike path would need to come out of the tunnel. It would cross Taylor Street and sort of meander over to the river's edge around the site to get back to the reconnect on the other side. Of course, this option, offers one of the higher parking counts of the 4, and obviously to follow that comes with one of the higher price tags. I would say that the other thing that we noted after doing this option, I think we kind of took a step back and said, well, gosh, that's a really massive building. Of course, there is some precedent on the site for buildings of similar height, but when you look at the general kind of mass of this, it's taking up a large area in comparison to some of the neighbors around. So we said, well, there is historic precedent for buildings that are really sort of massive like that in Lebanon, and of course you have some other housing projects going on now that sort of look at similar precedents. So I think that there are ways of taking a building like that and breaking down the scale to make it feel more human. We then kind of started looking at contemporary examples of other projects that deal with this in different ways. So, you know, this idea of introducing transparency at the ground floor, increasing the heights of ground floors to make the more human-focused spaces, inviting spaces and commercial opportunities. You know, other themes that we looked at to sort of mitigate the scale would be the repetition of elements, the use of some of vernacular forms like the arch top and the brick material, as well as just the general idea of stepping back of facades, sort of this penthouse idea that you can see on these bottom precedents. So we do think that for the scenario 4A, there's an architectural expression which might reinforce a very large building on this site. However, we looked at a slightly different way of breaking down scale with scenario 4B. So we took a look back in history. It's difficult to see here, but you know, this is from 1887 map of Lebanon. So once you start to look at buildings as clusters rather than sort of individual elements, you start to get some fairly decently scaled pieces here. So the thought process with this study was to say, well, we took the idea of the sort of building clusters, applied it to the site, and tried to see what kinds of you know, space between buildings or other sort of spaces for engagement we can create using a form and a mass that is sort of has historic context and it is really a sort of vernacular type form. So scenario 4B, just to step through, does a few things differently. Number one, it disconnects Taylor Street, so Taylor Street would no longer be a through street here. The traffic would need to be rerouted, possibly around through Flynn Court, but also around Park Street and Colburn Park. The other things that it did is it really emphasized the rail trail, the multi-use path, as sort of organizing element of the site. Which in turn sort of reinforce the existing topographic conditions. So basically, this yellow multi-use path that you can see here is generally following the existing retaining wall or step in the grade of the site. This often proposes to essentially deck over that lower parking area to create a parking, sheltered parking for about 108 cars. And it proposes also to parse the site into two pieces, one which would be essentially given over to a developer. That's this sort of white dotted line that you can see here. And then the other would be retained by the city. Day one, likely a surface parking area, similar to the existing paved area over near this part of the site. There would also be potential to build structured parking in that location at a future date if that were desired. So we then kind of extended this concept, similar thinking to the prior concept, developing a sort of commercial core, developing human-centric spaces that would be publicly facing, potentially programmed with food or business use, and then maintaining, Court Street would be converted to a one-way, and that would allow us enough space to maintain sort of a half and half condition where we split that space half for cars and half for this a little bit narrower green connection down toward the river. Layering on the housing component, again, we talked about the use of this sort of traditional gable form to create something that has visually interesting spaces for people. And so how do these sort of volumes come together, create open space in between which can be used by the public and the residents who would be living here. So this would be sort of the finished condition. You can see the rail trail sort of threads its way through a series of overlooks and tunnels underneath the building to get to the other side. So again, slightly, just to go through the numbers, slightly lower cost, I think primarily due to the slightly, or not slightly, more than slightly reduced parking. So this has about 100 parking spaces less than the prior scheme, and 81 residential units compared to 90 in the previous scheme. And again, we like to look at examples of how others have approached this. So this is just another example of a build project that takes that really fairly typical form, the gable form, and uses it in a slightly more contemporary way to create space between the buildings, offering space for people to go and socialize and sort of engage with one another outdoors. So just another example there. And this is the sort of plan comparison between the two. You can see they both use a similar sort of diagrammatic approach of trying to create this axial connection from Colburn Park down to the riverfront, by doing that in slightly different ways. And then on the bottom you can see just a really quick perspective vignette of the appearance from the, across the river. So again, that idea of the very large mass of the scenario 4A on the left, and then the sort of more broken down mass of the scenario B on the right. So we are going to get into the feasibility part of the discussion, just to kind of recap the scenarios that we've been through before we do that. We put together a little bit of a comparison chart here. I think to sort of study the trade-offs between these two options, I think some things are fairly evident from looking at the plans and images of the scenarios, right? The parking availability is highest in the parking configuration and lowest in the park scheme. Just a couple other things to point out here. This second bar, long-term fiscal impact, and John will explain that a little bit more, but this is just to look at, the sort of on an annual basis, what kind of fiscal impact might these scenarios have. And of course, the scenarios 1 and 2 being fully sort of city-funded initiatives with no resulting sort of revenue tend to have a negative fiscal impact. But what we found is that starting at scenario 3, you start to sort of break even, and then the 4 scenarios, just given their sort of fiscal advantages regarding tax base and things like that, tend to have a positive fiscal impact. So I think John's going to put a much finer point on that than I can possibly do, but this is just something that we developed to sort of communicate some of these ideas.
All right, thanks, Josh. Again, John with Landwise. So our effort here was to essentially do a high-level financial model and fiscal impact model, and the point of it was really to compare across the scenarios. To kind of understand, obviously they all have their own sort of opportunities and challenges, but really, what does it mean potentially for the city in terms of dollars and cents, both to create the new projects, the so-called capital costs, as well as kind of the ongoing kind of annual fiscal impacts to the city. So We're only showing kind of a summary takeaway here, but we'll just quickly kind of walk you through kind of the upshot. So for scenarios 1 and 2, as Josh just mentioned, those are really public projects, right? There isn't any new development on the site. It's really either reconfiguring the parking lot and adding a better sort of linear trail, or additionally providing a larger piece of kind of public open space and park space for the public enjoyment. And so essentially what we're showing there is that the costs are anywhere from $3 to $13 million for those 2 scenarios for the upfront costs, and then we've estimated kind of what the ongoing cost of maintenance is for those kind of new spaces, with the majority being obviously the new green space and riverfront trail. So not big dollars, but somewhere in the neighborhood for scenario 1, around $100,000. And then scenario 2, about $160,000 to maintain that new space for the city. So just kind of getting a sense of what that looks like. And then for scenarios 3, 4A, and 4B, and those obviously we're talking about bringing a development partner, right? So bringing a developer in to do those residential and fund the parking on the site. And so what we did was we modeled those projects from a developer perspective and said, okay, is there enough here to make this project financially feasible? Can we do this development and still provide replace some of the public parking spaces and provide this new multi-acre park space for public enjoyment? Can we do all of that and still have a positive return on this project? And the answer really is no, you don't quite get there. And so the numbers you're seeing here is that even with those real estate development projects, we estimate that the public, the required public investment is anywhere from $9 to $14 million for these scenarios. So for scenario 3, we're showing it at $9 million, which is about 25% of the overall cost of the whole project. For 4A, we have it about $14 million, and then for 4B, about $10 million. So another way to think about that would basically be like, the developer can essentially cover the cost of replacing the public parking spaces, but the public sector has to cover the park space essentially. That's one way to look at it. That's the upfront cost, but then of course there's kind of the ongoing impact to the city. And so when you look at that line, essentially we're showing scenario 3 as a break even. So it does create some additional property tax revenues, but it also has some additional population on the site, mainly school children that the city needs to educate. And so when you put that all together, it's essentially a break even scenario. So you're getting this new development without an ongoing fiscal cost to the city. And then for 4A and 4B, as you might expect, as the density sort of ramps up and you have more residential on site, those projects become increasingly fiscally positive, right? The additional tax revenue more than offsets the cost of operating the public spaces and educating students. These are very high level numbers, but I think directionally it shows the more density, the more housing, the more fiscally positive it is to the city. Josh, you can go ahead to the next one. And so I'm summarizing a lot of different, there's a lot of different assumptions that drive this, and I think we've provided slightly more detail in the appendix for folks who want to look at it. But some of the takeaways that we have in going through this exercise are that, clearly the public sector will need to identify some sources of funding for scenarios 1 and 2. There are available TIF funds, but it's not enough to fully fund those projects. So that's one thing to be aware of. The second thing is that, as I mentioned, the 3 development scenarios are not supporting, right? So the private sector can offset some of the costs, but it's also going to require some public partnership and public investment to pull off this. And the way that we think about it is, there are different levers that you can push and pull to affect the outcome of these developments. And so we just wanted to highlight a couple of the key ones. So the first one is about kind of the balance of market rate or affordable housing. So we've already pushed that lever as aggressively as we can. These are all market rate units. But we understand, obviously, that that's important to the community, and there's probably scenarios where we want to show what it looks like with whether it's 10% affordability or something of that nature. And the models are all set up to do that. We've run it in a lot of different ways, so you can certainly look at that if folks want to see it. The next thing is about the actual building programs themselves. So two things there. So civic space. So there are some, it's a modest amount, but there are some public spaces built into these projects, which obviously create a cost, but there's no revenue associated with it. And those are nice amenities for the citizens of Lebanon that we can certainly pull that space out if that's something we want to do. The other thing I'll mention is that, it is possible to have more housing density on the site. The team here, we wanted to sort of follow what we were hearing from the public and obviously the reaction from the initial proposals of developers and not push it to that, 150, 200 unit level that the developers were doing. But certainly, if that was a scenario, it could obviously be more fiscally positive for the city. But it doesn't meet all the goals that we've heard from the citizens. And then one thing to point out about the open space. So for scenarios 4A and B, when you're introducing parking structure and putting green spaces on top of structure, it's much more expensive. And so even though there's not a lot of that space in these scenarios, it's still enough that it impacts the cost. So that's something that certainly is good to be aware of. And then finally, there's the public parking spaces, right? So none of these scenarios replace all of the spaces. But they also don't add any revenue for them, right? So right now, we're assuming that the public spaces remain free. That's certainly something that is open to discussion, and if there was an appetite for, looking at what some revenue would look like on those spaces, the models account for that as well. Go to the next one, Josh. And then just on the real estate piece of it, you can think about the residential sites as kind of interchangeable between rental or for sale condos. And just in talking to the development community locally, the values are fairly similar. The rental is probably even a little bit higher, which is interesting. It's not always the case in all the markets we work in, but you can think of those as being interchangeable. And then finally, just in terms of the ongoing fiscal impact to the city, obviously scenarios 1 and 2 have, the increased maintenance costs that I mentioned, while the development schemes are, producing enough tax revenue to cover maintenance, educating students and everything else and come out with some net positive. So that's what you're getting that's the trade-off. If you allow residential on the site at any kind of level of density, essentially the project is a profit center for the city moving forward. So that's kind of the summary. I know that there's a lot there, and I'm sure people will have questions, but I think we'll leave it there for now, and then we can come back during the discussion period.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so we just have a couple more things. One of the questions that came up when we previewed this presentation with the city management, Sean, David, and Beth, is the impact of some of the schemes which alter Taylor Street to really reroute traffic around to other streets in the area. So we just went back to our traffic engineering partner, BHP, and talked through this at a very high level, just to understand what some of the implications might be. They're not engaged to study the park as a whole at the moment, but they were able to provide us with some just kind of high-level takeaways. So basically, I'll outline here. They did conduct a study of Taylor Street and the through traffic this summer as part of their scope of work. Essentially, the peak hour was counted on Thursday evening, which is a farmer's market evening in the summertime. They counted 272 vehicles per hour at the peak. So that assumes that essentially any scheme that closes Taylor Street in either one or both directions needs to reroute that traffic likely to the surrounding streets and around Colburn Park specifically. So there was some study of this done in 2016 that they took a look at. We can look at that in a minute, but it may require some upgrade to some of the streets and intersections in the Colburn Park area. Take a look at that in a minute. The only other thing I would point out is increasing two-way traffic flow on Taylor Street is a little bit problematic because it's currently quite narrow especially where it goes by the Ledger Charter School. And so any schemes which drive an increase in two-way traffic on that street would likely also require some impacts. And we just pulled these out of the 2016 vision study. These were some of the options that were considered at that time to improve the traffic flow around Colburn Park. So essentially the east side, I think is Bank Street and East Park, and this one coming in. That intersection there is sort of already quite challenging. I can recall first showing up at the site, not exactly knowing how to get to those back parking lots as someone who's unfamiliar with the area. So this intersection on the east side of Colburn is sort of already an issue. Any scheme which decouples Taylor Street may just sort of exacerbate that issue around the park with additional traffic. I think the kind of high level takeaway though is we don't know exactly how much traffic is running around Colburn Park at the moment. There were numbers from 2016, accounts conducted back then, but I think that the current condition is somewhat of an unknown. So understanding how much that 272 compares to what's currently routed around Colburn is what we are sort of not understanding at the moment, just because due to the scope of work. So, and that is sort of what we have. We want to look ahead to the next steps, but I think I'll just kind of run back to scenario comparison slide and just sort of do a deep breath, break, let some of this sink in, see if anyone has questions.
Does anyone?
No, no questions.
Can I ask if the latest slide deck could be emailed around? Because whatever I'm looking at doesn't really match up with
I apologize for that.
some of the slides. But
It's particularly the scenario comparison just looks a little different.
right, and I guess my version doesn't have cost estimates and all that.
I think this is where the cost estimates are. That was just this paper that's on our.
Yes, we can, I will send out this slide deck. Yeah,
Yeah.
what ended up in the packet was, was my fault. That's what we saw when we previewed this with the consultants just the week prior to Thanksgiving. And obviously, they've made some further refinements over the last couple of weeks to the point of what you're seeing tonight. But I've got this now, and I'll send it around.
I have questions. Okay, I guess I have to turn this on. Am I on? It's on. Okay, I have more than one question. First of all, the parking numbers on the various scenarios, are those open, public, or do they include parking for the housing units? So each number of parking spaces that you have on each scenario, is that just public parking, or does that include parking for the housing units?
I would say that varies by example. The packet that you were handed before the meeting does contain a little bit more information. I think it's page 1 of that packet on the assumptions for various schemes. So down here, if you look at that first page of that packet, so we've itemized residential parking spaces versus replacement parking spaces. In other words, public parking or parking beyond what's been dedicated to the residential units. And just so you know, we've allocated 1.5 spaces per unit. I don't believe there's a zoning requirement in this part of town for parking per unit, but this is sort of a good median between 1, which felt a little bit too low, and 2, which felt like too much.
Is it my understanding our base need number today is 225 for what's used back there? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's based on the percentage of use that was documented most recently this July, as a percentage of what's actually out there. So I believe it was around 68%. Josh, correct me if I'm wrong on that. It was
Yeah, 65.
65% out of, I think there's 333 spaces, so that two-thirds of that is,
So theoretically, you'd need 225 plus whatever you need for the new development, correct?
yes.
Okay.
And that was also done when the Opera House wasn't in session this summer, and we've had some pretty big shows at the Opera House, so they're using a good
It
amount
was
of
a
that.
farmer's market night, but you're right, it was not, we never could find a date this summer or even into the fall when farmer's market and an Opera House event were happening at the same time.
And some of the farmers, or the Opera House events this fall have been sellouts, and so they're probably completely sold out, so the parking lot's been pretty busy this year. It's slowed down again now. Another question I have is do the cost and revenue impacts, does that include the impacts on city services? Because this is going to increase city services for sure. So do those numbers that you've given us, cost and revenue, does that also include impact on the city services?
So if you look at the detail there, basically what we looked at, I meant the two big things were the maintenance of the new facility and then school costs, which is obviously the biggest line item. Our understanding is that some of the other, like police and fire, that probably doesn't increase substantially, but there's also fiscal impact fees that cover some of that, but we've shown fiscal impact fees on a lot of line there at this stage.
That's page 4 is what is on the screen, and
Okay, that's what, yeah, that's page 4.
page 4 out of 5.
Okay. And then, do we have a title issue update?
Yes, we've gone back to the title company through some additional research by the surveyor himself and internally. Paula Mabel was able to track down some documents. We've pulled all that together. The attorneys themselves were able to find some documents at the registry and at the Superior Court level for some of the condemnations that occurred back in the 60s. We've provided all of that back to the title company and asked them to take a fresh look at the information and how they feel about it, how comfortable they are with either title insurance or some sort of title certification. The one item that we do control with respect to the boundary line between the city's parking lot property and the Grafton County Senior Citizens Council property, which extends into our parking lot. That's in front of the planning board right now. It would have been this past Monday, but I had to defer that to the January 13th meeting. So I would expect that issue to effectively be resolved after January 13th.
Resolved in favor of what?
So basically, they've agreed, the Senior Citizens Council has agreed to convey about 2,200 square feet to the city so that the portion that exists under our parking lot and also picks up a couple of the large trees, that will become city property. And therefore, we won't have a title issue or a boundary line issue in that portion of the parking lot. That's just on this side, sort of south of the former rail right-of-way. So that's where things stand. We have not heard back from the title company yet. We would hope to have that soon. I don't know where it's going to end up. There may end up being a need for some quiet title actions because we haven't been able to find some of the information in the middle of the parking lots, for example. But they've been parking lots now for 50 or 60 years. And so we think a quiet title action may resolve some of those issues. We still believe we have some sticking points with the DOT and what they control as part of the former B&M Railroad corridor. So those are some of the things that are still being looked at.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll just say that I think this is really interesting and I appreciate this update. I guess one question I have is what is the next steps? And yeah, I guess what is the next steps?
And I'll add to that by saying, and what does staff want from us?
Yeah.
Good point.
Could you repeat that second part?
what's the next step in your process, and then what does the city administration want from these two committees?
I'll let Josh answer the first question about next steps. We sort of covered that at the beginning, but we'll come back to that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so we envision this as basically as a preview meeting of the January meeting, which is going to be advertised as a sort of broader public forum. So the content of that presentation will be developed over the next month or so. It will be taking into account feedback we received tonight, as well as development of the sort of visual material that we've presented to you. It'll be honing in on some more specifics with, or coordinating the design advancements with the feasibility, the performance information that you've seen tonight. There's still a little bit of work to do there, and then probably presenting a version of all of this material to the public. I think it would be less detail on the financial side, but maybe a little bit more developed design information, in short.
And I think in terms of what the administration is looking for and the consultant is looking for is your thoughts, your impressions on where we are in the process. We've talked about the history, how we got to where we are, the public sessions that were had at the end of September and the public comments that were received then, and now beginning to take those ideas and those concepts and turn them into development concepts, basically. How does this strike you as that they're on the right track in terms of turning those ideas and those thoughts into development scenarios for consideration? Again, they've mentioned several times that this is sort of a midstream check-in before we get to, as we continue to flesh this out. Does anything jump out at you that they're off track, or any other thoughts that you have?
If I may, no, I think this is very, very helpful. I think that like making democracy or sausage, you never really want to know what the ingredients are, but you like the final product, and we're all trying to put a number of constraints together. What I'm curious about is during this process of coming up with 4 or 5 different scenarios, was there, during those discussions, taking traffic on Taylor Street as the primary goal to facilitate that? Or was the access of the rail trail connection from the tunnel to the Northern Rail Trail a primary goal? We know about parking and housing and development and so on, but I'm thinking of those elements because they're physical elements on the ground. And I also noticed that many of the plans showed the rail trail or the bike path going in front of the CCB on the north side of the street, which you can't do that because then you're blocking off traffic between the parking and just walking into the CCB. Currently, it's on the south side of Taylor Street. But I'm looking at, taking those viatic uses, the transitory or transit uses by bikes or cars. Can you put that in as sort of the primary source and then build around that? I look at the drone picture that you took from above the CCB, I presume drone, and I can't help but think that there's plenty of space in there for development or a park along the river and development on the upper side. And I'm not sure if we need a huge park down there because I don't want to discourage the use of our village green. I think having 2 large green spaces may dilute. On the other hand, maybe they'll both be wildly successful. But certainly the upper parking lot, there's plenty of room up there for some kind of development. But I will say that the financial numbers are daunting, and I guess given where we are with the budget session, certainly we're not looking to have the city incur any greater liability. So I guess I'm looking at how the process to come up with the 4 or 5, and then, and the elements that went into building those. If those are the types of things we have, then clearly somewhere in that spectrum we'll be able to come up with something, the details for which may be very different.
Yeah, go ahead.
Karen and then Chip?
Yeah, please.
Sure. So one of the things I wanted to point out and to make sure that our consultants are aware of is that we are looking, the city, we're about to adopt a budget next week. The proposal is for a 12% tax rate increase, followed by 3 years of double-digit tax rate increases. And we are hearing loud and clear from residents that those are simply not sustainable. We knew that already, but they're coming out to in record numbers to make sure that we understand that before the vote. And so I think it's going to be important in the whatever forum you do in January to make sure that you are especially making the comparison to the status quo. And then I think really making sure we have clear answers about kind of if we decided to do nothing, what's the do nothing option? Because even the do nothing option is going to have some cost associated with it. And so I think, I'm offering that to city staff, but also to our consultants, that I don't think there's going to be tremendous public appetite for an expansive project. And, much as I might be interested in that myself, I think we have to be really sensitive to the context and the times that we're living in. And I think right now people are feeling very anxious economically. There's going to be a new administration at the federal level. People have a lot of anxiety about how that's going to affect us in the municipal environment, in the state environment. So I think there's just a lot of anxiety about how things are going to be. And so in the context of anxiety, then I think people are going to be very interested in the do nothing scenario. And so we're going to want to make sure that we have really good information to share with the public about the reality of a do nothing scenario. Because unfortunately, or fortunately, I think that may end up being the most palatable to the public. So I think to the degree that you are spending time honing in and thinking about how to prepare for this public presentations, I don't think that we need to spend so much time on the full development alternatives. I just don't think those are going to be very realistic in the times that we're living in. So, whereas I think the discussion will probably be more focused on the lower impact, the lower cost scenarios. I don't know if anyone would disagree with me on that. I think, I'd be interested to know if people agree, generally speaking, with that. But I think that's pretty solid advice. And then secondly, I don't see in here, but I would be very interested one of the things that we've talked about for a long time is the idea of creating a serious sheltered bus station behind City Hall. So, that was always the intention, at least that was what Advanced Transit presented to us 10 years ago when we allowed them to temporarily move their primary bus station from Court Street over in front of City Hall. They promised us that location would be temporary, and that they would work with us to create a more sort of sustainable solution that would include some sheltered parking, where City Hall, the Lebanon Opera House lobby, is not essentially a sheltered bus station during the day. And so I think, and also City Hall's not open all the time, so there's not really a sheltered bus stop, and it's one of the busiest bus stops in the whole system. So I'd be interested in if one of the options could show some sheltered, a fairly robust sheltered bus station or bus stop. I don't think it has to have facilities necessarily, although even a porta potty, I think over in West Lebanon has proven to be very well used. But even just a shelter would be I would be very interested to see that. I think that could be a significant improvement for downtown Lebanon, and also would be consistent with what the public's understanding of how advanced transit would be interacting with downtown Lebanon over the past decade.
Jim?
I guess my thought in looking through some of the fiscal impact numbers and some of the cost numbers that were presented, and kind of pinging on what Barry was saying, I was thinking kind of the same thing. Is the scenarios, most of the scenarios seem to be taking a lot of the parking or converting all the parking to park and putting underbuilding parking like scenario 3, for example. And the question is, could we retain some of the parking on the lower level, make a smaller park that does open up the river, does bring people down to the river, and retain more parking? I think the other thing that I noticed was, it struck me as the taxable assessed values of the different scenarios seem light from what I know of values and costs right now. And I think the way, the number of units in different scenarios also, I'm not clear on if that's been maximized. I think to Karen's point, the public in the city and everybody is extraordinarily sensitive to additional hits to the tax base, and I think we should figure out ways to. Maybe nothing long term is a hit to the tax base, but the question is, are there other solutions to this that could be zero impact to the tax base, but also give the city a waterfront park? And that's
like a 2B, so are you kind of saying like maybe we need like is it 2A and 2B, the riverfront park option?
I don't know.
A toned down version of the
maybe
riverfront?
it's a 2B, or maybe it's a 3B, or I don't know. But I think that it would be worthwhile to drill down on sort of, what our taxable values are out of this, and how much of this whole land base, which is enormous spot, right? I mean, you can rack up a whole lot of dollars building a park across that entire parking lot. And I don't know that that's needed. But I think the idea of a waterfront park that's not just a little pocket park, but it's a real space, but gets people down to the river, will resonate from everything we've heard from the visioning study on. That's been a big public interest, and I think it's been something that will add value to the tax base, not take away value from the tax base. So I would urge us to continue to try to be creative and thoughtful about what will cost the city the least and gain the city the most.
Josh, can I maybe answer the one about the unit count and whether we maximize development here? Is that okay?
Sure.
So if you scroll to the developer schemes, I mean, we did test this, and we figured it was something that the various groups would want to know, but essentially, if you look at the developer schemes, we ran a model for about 160 units, and at that level, financially, it's essentially a self-supporting project where, it doesn't require the city to put in additional money, and obviously it produces more positive fiscal impact. The issue is it's essentially a giant development site. You can add public open space, and there can be a park space, but most of it's on structure, and it just feels very different. The question is whether that meets the goals of the community. But anyway, so if you look at the roadie proposal there, something closer to that where they're showing these open spaces on top of structure, and they've got 210 units, you could probably reduce that a little bit, but essentially that's the scheme. And so we decided as a group not to go there, but that's kind of what it takes from a unit count.
Christine?
I was just remembering those previous suggestions that we decided didn't fit what we wanted to do, and I don't think the public was much interested in having so much development in the parking lot because they were worried about losing access to any open space and blocking it. I mean, that would just be another big mass of brick. But when you were commenting on the financials, I'm not a anyway understand how to look at money very well, but it occurred to me that the way you have the on the fiscal impacts, when you're using the number 3 and 4A and 4B, how do we think about annual cost of any of those 5 proposals? Because even something that's maybe generating taxes, it looks like is going to be costing the city money to have there. So, and it looks like the only 2 that are gonna cost the city anything are Don't Do Anything and the Riverfront Park, and I don't think that's what the numbers are saying, but maybe there's another way of showing what each of those proposals actually cost the city to have. Maybe I'm looking at it the wrong way, but.
Yeah, it's the Josh, if you go back to the chart, that's the actual show. It's the blue line, that's the sort of the net to the city. Right here. This is the net, and so the thought is that the full redevelopment schemes do produce a net positive fiscal impact to the city. Obviously, we can look at the assumptions, we can debate whether they're right, but that's what this is saying. Whereas scenario 3 essentially breaks even, and then the other 2 scenarios, cost the city to additional maintenance costs on the park trail and open space component. That's at the very summary level.
Could you explain the potential required public investment piece? Because that was one thing that didn't make sense to me at first, but that's essentially I want to use the term shortfall, but what would be...
it's the gap essentially. So it's basically saying that's the additional money required to make this whole project financially feasible, to basically attract the developer to do this project. So it's a shortfall, right? So, and you can make that up either by adding public investment or by adding additional density or those other levers that I went through. And so if you look at 3, 4A, and 4B, if the city or there isn't some other funding to fill that gap, then you're not going to have a project. It would be more, you have to reduce the size of the park space, you have to reduce the parking count, you have to somehow value engineer those dollars out to make the project work. And that's essentially what it's expressing. And so, as I was saying, these development projects, as they're shown here with this level of density, they essentially cover the replacement parking but not the open space, is a simple way to think about it.
So those numbers are just how much money is generated though. It's not including, for example, snow removal or extra police or a fire in the buildings or any of like the normal things that are gonna happen when you have buildings. There, that doesn't include any of that. Or like
Yeah, so,
cleaning the tree, raking the leaves or, that kind of stuff.
so you're talking about the fiscal impact specifically, so this is the bottom line here. So it does include raking the leaves, it includes all the maintenance of what these scenarios would look like, and it also includes the main public expense, which is educating school children. We didn't go into the police and fire for a couple of reasons. One, there are some costs associated with what's happening there today, right? In terms of the parking lot, and then there's also, there are impact fees associated with these developments, and it's on one of the pages in the reference where there are some additional monies that cover those things. So we didn't want to essentially double count. So it's a simplification, but this is the net positive. So it takes all that tax revenue, it pulls out the education costs, it pulls out the maintenance costs, and then the police and fire stuff, and anything else is basically we're considering that included in the impact fees. And again, we can change any of that, but that's what you're looking at now.
David? Dave, I have a question for you. So I know when we met, I don't know, at some point, we talked about some real need in the parking lot soon. And so,
Structure?
yeah, we knew that the retaining wall had some issues.
Right.
If we go back and, let's say we do the retaining wall, we do these things, and I guess I should know this as a ZBA member, but maybe I don't. But like, if we do enough work on the parking lot, are we then required to start putting in trees and green space to like, if we do enough into the parking lot, because right now it's basically just a tarmac, right? And I know that when we see designs for parking lots, they have trees in them now. Will that trigger us to have to do this a portion of scenario one anyway, or no?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, you're talking about the site plan review regulations that require certain kinds of lights, certain kinds of trees. Those don't apply strictly to a city project.
Okay.
They could apply to a private development, but the city's exempt from, it's not exempt, it doesn't exempt itself from zoning.
Right.
But it does exempt itself from the site plan just the site plan regulations.
Okay.
But
So
that
we
would be a
could
very
add-
interesting exercise, though, if this was, if we were to do the work on the parking lot to the standards that we expect of private developers, how much of this work would we be doing?
Right.
I mean, often.
That would be an interesting, I think if you could do that exercise, I think that would be a very interesting one.
Often it's the case when you've got something that is so non-conforming with respect to its location adjacent to the river, with respect to the lack of shade trees and
Right.
things like that. Basically, the requirement is, when you're going to the planning board, is that you make it a little bit better. If you can pull it away from the river, great. If you can add a couple of trees, as opposed to like completing the 30% shading requirement that might otherwise be required if this was a wholly new construction. I mean, we could take a look at that. I don't know. I mean, they're showing, Josh is showing on the screen right now, part of what that scenario one could look like. It does add quite a bit of trees. Whether that gets to the 30% shading requirement of the site plan regulations, I'm gonna guess no, just at a glance, but we'd have to calculate that.
So my question wasn't great, but Karen said it much better than I. I mean, I think it's worth presenting.
I mean, I think that, as you pointed out, the do nothing, there really is no do nothing option.
Right.
because
That's, I think, one.
Just keeping the parking lot as a parking lot is gonna come with some maintenance costs to fix retaining walls and guardrails, to repave, to redo sidewalks and curbing and all that stuff. So those are long-term costs, and there's no foreseeable revenue without some development to offset those costs.
And so that was the $3 to $4 million cost?
That's, and I don't know all the details as to where that 3 to 4 came from. Maybe, I don't know if Josh or Kate could speak to how.
Well, maybe not tonight, because I think we're at the end of our meeting. I'm
But
expiring.
yeah, no. Any other questions while we've
Well,
got a
I
team? and-
just that I want to underscore what Chip said, that I think, and also what Chris said, because I do think that there's just not going to be much appetite for 4A and 4B, honestly. That level of development, that level, that intensity, it's just not, and it wasn't particularly appealing a few months ago or last year when we heard about it from the public. And then given the budget scenario and kind of the economic sensitivity that people are feeling, I think it's not realistic. And so, but I do think it might be worth creating a 2A and a 2B or a 3B, some version in there where the park is a little smaller, and we try and kind of find a happy medium. So I would be interested, or I guess that would be just a thought, that if it's possible to maybe present, instead of 4A and 4B, or you leave them in there if you have them, but to maybe build out a 2A and a 2B, or a 3A and a 3B, whatever, some of those.
I would, sorry,
And the baseline.
finally.
And the baseline, build out the baseline.
One thing that we haven't touched on at all here, but just sort of thinking through potential ideas is, we're sitting here with a TIF group. If a new development happens elsewhere downtown, and there was allocated tax dollars that would come into this project, then all of a sudden you don't have to have that density on site. You can have density elsewhere that contributes to this site.
Right.
Because it's contributing to downtown and the vitality of downtown.
So I have still a day job that needs to get finished, so
Yeah.
I'm going to break up the quorum of the TIF committee, but I'd like to suggest to our consultants, first of all, thank you for your time today. And interestingly, you heard fewer comments about design and more about economics. So I think some flexibility in how you design with a sensitivity to the economics would be very helpful when you present. But otherwise, thank you very much, and thank you, committees.
I move that we adjourn.
Second, all in favor?
Aye. Thank you.